Welcome back. In this lecture and a PowerPoint slide presentation, we're going to be moving on to the next group of ante-Nicene fathers, and they're called the Apologists. This first part of this lecture will be about the challenges of the era of the Apologists, and that era is essentially the 2nd century, a little bit into the 3rd century when we get further on. And then we'll be taking a break, so there'll be a second video to complete this set of PowerPoints that will look at a few of the earliest, minor in some respects, not as well known apologists, but individuals that are significant for our study. And so let me get to that right away. So we're going to be looking at the apologists, and as I said, our first look will be at the challenges of this era for Christian historical theology. In the 2nd century, writes Alan Peterson, the Roman Empire was enjoying a period of relative peace and security, even prosperity. Same author notes, the 2nd century Greco-Roman world, especially speaking, was one of confidence, peace, and prosperity. At this particular time, the rulers of Rome had a powerful military to keep what had been called for a while now the Pax Romana, or Peace of Rome. They had able administrators working with them that improved infrastructures, think things like streets, sanitation, roads. They had developed better financial systems. They had simply more stable social structures all the way around. However, the entire culture was quite sensitive on the matter of religion. They were, as Paul observes of the Athenians in Acts 17:22, very religious in all respects. Worship and serving the gods was not seen as a private act, but had very serious social and civic implications. In other words, the practices of what we would consider very private religious practices, for them were not so much private. They were not so much personal. It was a societal, social obligation, even in the case of emperor worship, a political obligation to keep the gods happy, to keep the gods appeased so that they would continue to provide this security and peace that we just described. And furthermore, it wasn't just a matter of serving one god. I'm summarizing Alan Peterson's work here, but all the gods, even the gods of other lands and cultures. So they didn't really think in terms of just one particular god or one particular even pantheon of gods, but for them it was better to honor all the gods, just all the gods everywhere. Don't offend any of them. And again, this was something that the entire community took seriously, so that the entire community would have the prosperity, the peace, the security, and the provisions that they believed the gods provided to them for everybody. So everybody needed to be worshiping all the gods. In the Roman Empire, especially, they needed to be worshiping the emperor because you didn't want to get the emperor upset with you. And so everybody should be worshiping as many gods as they could. And again, the idea was you can't be too careful. So just worship all of them. But this is what the church could not do. And indeed, before the church, even the Jews wouldn't participate in any of this polytheistic religion. They had actually worked things out with Rome. They were a distinct people, socially, even ethnically, even then, but especially religiously. And the Jews had been given the privilege of opting out because they still paid their taxes, and there was a fairly small minority in the entire empire as well. And so I suppose the reasoning was that they could afford to let the Jews be monotheists and the gods would just kind of look the other way as long as everybody else was still honoring the gods. But the church, although at first was seen as an offshoot of Judaism, was made up of all sorts of people and was not ethnically related, but was from all levels of society. You can see how this would be a problem if you're drawing off members from not just one minority group like the Jews, but people from every level of society, every sort of political, social, or ethnic background. were beginning to flock to this new thing, the church, they could see the seeds of getting God's angry all across the board. So Christianity was considered to be a religio illicita. That is, everything that they did, they considered to be something that was contrary to the social structure and cohesion of the empire. And every social ill, every natural disaster, every setback to the general prosperity of the empire came to be blamed on Christians. We'll talk a little about that more in a future lecture on the subject of persecutions. That's coming up this week as well. The wider society, especially when threatened by a natural calamity, again, or hostile peoples or something of that nature, wished that sacrifices to be offered again by every member of society, because again, this was to appease any divine anger, any god that might be upset with them. And so by honoring its gods, and again, all the gods, and pagans could do this easily, they could worship all the different gods, that the entire society, everyone would be recipients of the gods of peace. However, even when not threatened by natural calamity or hostile peoples, the wider society wished that these sacrifices, that the honoring of all the gods would be offered by as many members of society as possible, because they recognized that these are the kind of practices that made for the building up of communities. They were sort of like making sure that everybody was on the same page, socially speaking. So it was something that they did in order to make sure everybody in that particular time and culture was really cohesive. And when you have a small group of people that refuse to go along with what everybody else in the culture is doing, not only is that just off-putting, they saw it as something that was definitely threatening. So again, because Christians would not participate in the pagan polytheistic cults or sacrifice incense to Caesar, nor attend the gladiatorial contest, because they did engage in their own rites of baptism and communion with their agape feasts. And this, again, was something that this whole society, the wider society, didn't understand. What are these communions? What are these agape feasts? What are you doing with these children when you're baptizing them? And because they took in orphans and foundlings, they were very compassionate, but the world really didn't really quite understand what they were doing. Why do you want these children? They're cast off by everybody else. Why would you want them? In any case, because they did not love the world nor the things in the world, the word hated them. And again, that should be no surprise to us, because this is what the Lord told us we should expect from the world. So in the 2nd century, Christianity faced a hostile world. Rome had declared Christianity illegal. Christians faced death, miserable existences in Roman prisons or slavery. And these wild charges circulated about Christian worship and practice. And elitist Romans often charged that only the basest people, the slaves, the criminals, and the poverty-stricken, became Christians. So you can see that there was this concerted effort to delegitimize and in some fashion even dehumanize the Christians because they felt like they were a threat to the wider society. So sometime after AD 20, at the year 120 in the 2nd century, Christians began to respond to their accusers' charges, and some of these were written responses, and these written responses were came to be known as the Apologia, and those who were writing them, the Apologists. And that actually comes from 1 Peter 3:15, where Peter encourages his readers to sanctify the Lord in your hearts, always being ready to give a defense for the hope that lies within you. And that word defense in 1 Peter 3:15 is the Greek word apologia, from which we get our word apologetics. It just means an answer. It can mean an answer in a court of law, but it can just mean answering somebody, over the fence, or your next door neighbor's questions. But these writers were, in particular, answering these wild charges and answering the accusations that the Christians were disrupting the social fabric. The author's purpose was not evangelism so much as an attempt to offer a rationale for the believers, for Christians' right to exist. Although not terribly intellectual, although some were, some apologists were well versed in heathen philosophies. We're going to see that. These apologists often had no theological training. They simply knew what their society was all about, and they were responding to it. They generally argued that Christianity fulfilled Old Testament prophecy. They refuted these charges of atheism. Christians were charged with being atheists. Why? Because they denied the gods. And you would say, well, but Christians worship the one true God and the Lord Jesus Christ. But you see, again, for them, that denial of all those other gods was amounted to atheism, even if you only worship one. Sexual immorality, where did that come from? Well, again, it was these communion services, these love feasts, the fact that Christians congregated in secret places because it was an illegal religion. They had to do that. But wild rumors about what went on in these meetings. The agape feast, agape is the word for love. So love feasts in the minds of these immoral pagans had a connotation that was not favorable to Christians. And even cannibalism. And of course, that probably comes from the fact that in the communion service, it was said that Christians were eating the body of Christ and drinking his blood as the Lord had commanded in the communion in the Gospels. And so, again, these strange accusations to our ears, but they were the kinds of things that Christians had to answer. Now, as we start talking about these various apologists, we know really very little about them, at least the first few that we're going to be looking at. They did have a wide readership among other Christians and even among other apologists, and that's really why they're kind of important. So in the next lecture, we're going to stop this one early, and we're going to create a new video for the rest of these slides. But what we'll be considering are the earliest of the apologists. And again, they're not very well known, not as well as some of the other ante-Nicene fathers that we have looked at and will be looking at, but nevertheless significant for understanding the theology of this particular era, which was a very important era because it's the 2nd century. It's when the New Testament has come together and the church is trying to practically apply what they have learned from the scriptures, even in the context where, as we're going to see in a future lecture, the persecutions made that sort of difficult. So what we're going to be looking at here is the appearance of educated and literate Christian men who made it possible to defend the faith with their apologies and defend themselves and the church against the slanders and attacks of the pagans. So we will stop for now, and I'll see you on the next video.